HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Commanders, the leadership journeys of George Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and Erwin Rommel, by Lloyd Clark, read by Julian. Introduction. Towards the end of his long and distinguished life, I visited Field Marshal the Lord Bramall at his home in Hampshire. Although he was over 90 years of age, I found that Dwin, as he insisted I call him, had lost none of his passion for discussing military affairs and, in particular, leadership. His precise and persuasive arguments that morning about what he felt made an effective leader drew heavily from a career that began leading a 35-man platoon in Normandy on the 8th of June 1944 and ended 40 years later as Chief of the Defence Staff, the professional head of the British Armed Forces. As the Field Marshal plunged deep into history to illustrate the importance of apt leadership styles and why it is vital to win trust, I began to understand more why he was one of the most accomplished military leaders Britain has ever produced. Dwin deployed an argument as deftly as a general might maneuver his principal fighting division, as he expounded on the enduring nature of leadership across the millennia, referencing Bernard Montgomery heavily during our conversation. Monty could be an exceptional leader, he explained, with a great talent for putting his message across and getting things done how he wanted, but could also be extremely difficult. There was no doubt that Dwin admired much about Montgomery. The Field Marshal presented a young Lieutenant Bramall with the ribbon for a military cross awarded for his leadership in October 1944, when he cleared a German post with grenades and his Sten gun. Before Bramall met the great man at the presentation, one of Montgomery's aides had given him some advice. The Field Marshal will ask you whether you and he have ever met before. He will not mind if you say yes or no, but he will mind if you say you can't remember. Dwin chuckled at the memory, shaking his head. As our discussion progressed, Dwin became keen to discuss what he termed the privilege of responsibility. Whether leading a small team in combat to seize tactically important ground, or clashing with Whitehall mandarins over the implications of budget cuts, the personal sense of responsibility, Dwin expounded, does not feel different, and nor does the sense that one is extremely fortunate to be faced with such challenges and looked to by others for a way forward. Taking a pause to gather his thoughts, but looking me straight in the eye, he continued, "It does not matter what one's appointment is or the tests that one faces. Leadership is essential. Leadership underpins everything the army does and involves everybody. Success is always founded on good leadership, while with failure the opposite is very often true. It is vital, absolutely vital, to find a way to inspire men to do the mundane as well as the extraordinary. Yes, inspire is the correct word. Inspire and motivate." The Field Marshal then explained how he and those who inspired him encouraged men to follow. He emphasized his belief that the methods and style adopted by an individual leader have to take account of many variables if they are to be successful. Academics David J. and John Antonakis concur, having written that leadership is shaped by the leader's dispositional characteristics and behaviors, follower perceptions and attributions of the leader, and the context in which the influencing process occurs. Yet while obvious attributes such as moral courage, decisiveness, and calmness under pressure are essential for leader effectiveness, it is leadership skills, such as the ability to communicate, empathize, and create an esprit de corps, which will make a leader potent. Successful military leaders therefore need to possess both intra- and interpersonal skills if their leadership is to work, and this requires constant attention to the art of leading and constant attention to how they might improve their abilities. As Harry S. Laver and Jeffrey J. Matthews note in The Art of Command, a study of 9 commanders from George Washington to Colin Powell, their careers demonstrate that the quality of one's leadership ability develops over years, even decades. None of them began their careers in the military as exceptional leaders. They did, however, have the good fortune to serve under effective mentors and, more significantly, each had the good sense to learn from the examples set by these role models. With each new role, every advance in rank, and each new context, it is particularly important that officers and soldiers think again about their leadership and what is demanded of them. While an army will do what it can to prepare individuals for the next stage in their career, for traditionally armies grow their own leaders, self-development remains indispensable because there is always a need to translate organizational training and education into something that reflects the leader as an individual. Even if enlisted soldiers make up by far the greater proportion of an army, finding time to improve one's leadership is particularly important to officers because they dominate command appointments in which they have legal responsibility for the direction, coordination, and control of military forces. Leadership is an indispensable constituent of command, which makes its own heavy demands on an individual's professional and personal competencies. But no matter what role or context an officer happens to be working in, proficient leadership drives military effectiveness, for as the ancient Greek writer Herodotus wrote nearly 2,500 years ago, "Circumstances rule men, men do not rule circumstances." In being recognized as the personification of an army's values, standards, and leadership philosophy, a leader not only creates a positive local climate but helps to reinforce the healthy organizational culture upon which the army's fighting power depends. It is a poorly advised army, therefore, that does not take heed of Jörg Muth's assertion in his book Command Culture that troops fight the way they are led, and ultimately, fighting is what an army exists to do. During our discussion about military culture, Dwin Bramall began to speak with great knowledge about the impact of three particular leaders: George Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and Erwin Rommel. Born between 1885 and 1891, they came into the world at the height of an industrial revolution which powered the Age of Empire in Europe and the Gilded Age in the United States and fueled the First World War. All three officers participated in the 1914-18 cataclysm, and like millions of others, the Field Marshal emphasized, were so affected by their wartime experiences that it became a fundamental influence on their lives. Yet neither Patton, Montgomery, nor Rommel were dissuaded by the carnage from seeking military careers when the guns finally fell silent, and in time the army became their greatest passion. Each became wholly dedicated to the profession of arms, and, being exceptional officers and leaders, they prospered. Yet despite the broad similarities between the three men, there were marked differences in their approaches to leadership due to the individuality bestowed on them by their genes, upbringing, life experience, and relationships. Together, these stimuli created three unique personalities, which, in turn, determined each man's leadership style. During our discussion about the complex and nuanced web of what makes one man willingly follow another, the Field Marshal suggested that I use the lives of Patton, Montgomery, and Rommel to reveal the short steps on the long journey of leadership. The result is this book, which seeks, through the eyes of a military historian, to explore the many and various influences that shaped Patton, Montgomery, and Rommel as men, as soldiers, and principally as leaders. It will chart their leadership development through war and peace, and through good times and bad. It is a military biography of three officers, viewed through the prism of leadership, as they became among the most prominent officers in their armies, and eventually, in early 1943, all fought in Tunisia. North Africa, however, did not mark the end of the leadership odyssey for Patton, Montgomery, or Rommel. It instead acted as a waypoint on the route to a final confrontation in Northern Europe, at the end of which two of these remarkable men would be dead. Chapter 1. Early Years and Junior Leaders, 1880s to 1914. In late spring 1905, the body of shoemaker Hiram Cronk was displayed in the main lobby of New York City Hall. Cronk was given this honor not because he had been 105 years of age at the time of his passing, but because he had been the last surviving veteran of the War of 1812. When his body was finally removed from view, after some 925,000 people visited to pay their respects, Cronk was transported through New York streets lined with thousands of onlookers in a hearse drawn by 4 gleaming black horses and escorted by men who had fought in the Civil War. Remarking on a scene that he felt marked the end of a more noble era, the correspondent of West Virginia's Bluefield Daily Telegraph recorded that the old soldier was the last link connecting the simplicity of Jefferson's day with the strenuous complexity of the present. The Second Industrial Revolution and the rapid economic growth that accompanied it had ushered in a new age. Advances in manufacturing technology were supported by a rapidly developing railway network that linked modern cities and had, along with the telegraph and telephones, transformed the nation by the dawn of the 20th century. An aspirational society agitated for government-led reform, while men of influence called for the United States to exert itself more forcefully in the international arena. A stronger, more confident nation with a clear identity had emerged, and it rippled with ambition. By 1905, the balance of the world's power was shifting, and in this dangerous but opportunity-laden arena, George S. Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and Erwin Rommel sought to make their mark. The 19th century was filled with dominant figures, colossi that strode the world stage, and whether politicians or generals, artists or businessmen, explorers or sportsmen, kept increasingly literate populations absorbed by their achievements, and in that patriarchal society, exceptionally successful specimens of the male sex were used by their respective nations as inspirational figures in a competitive era. Indeed, in 1841, the philosopher Thomas Carlyle published On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History, in which he argued that great men should rule and that other men should revere them. Yet while Carlyle believed that the great should be role models for the young, he also theorized that their successful emulation was limited to those blessed with inherently heroic dispositional traits at birth. A generation later, however, the notion that an individual's ability to achieve the remarkable was determined solely by what we now know as genetics was challenged by those who postulated that the creation of leaders also depended on the environment into which they were born. In 1873, for example, Herbert Spencer opined in The Study of Sociology that early social conditioning molded personalities, outlook and approach, and that before a great man can remake his society must make him. Patton, Montgomery, and Rommel were, therefore, born to an era in which the dominant belief was that privileged upper-middle-class professional and aristocratic families alone formed the leadership class. For it was thought offspring not only inherited the most favorable genes for the task, but were also exposed to the positive societal influences that were required to develop the necessary traits. George S. Patton, Jr. was born to a wealthy family of high achievers. In the century before his birth, his ancestors included Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, Democrat Congressman John Mercer Patton, and the latter's son George Smith Patton, who, with 7 of his brothers, fought under the Confederate flag during the Civil War. An accomplished leader who displayed great personal courage, coolness, and decisiveness, George Smith Patton was mortally wounded aged 31 while commanding a brigade in the Third Battle of Winchester in September 1864. He was laid to rest next to his brother, Waller Tazewell Patton, who himself had died of wounds during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg in July the previous year, while commanding the 7th Virginia Infantry Regiment. The stories of their heroism and sacrifice were well known to George Smith Patton's 4 children, including George S. Patton, whose impoverished mother, Susan, instilled in him a set of strong values during his upbringing in California. Based on loyalty, hard work, and discipline, Mrs. Patton's principles were to stand her son in good stead for his time at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, during the mid-1870s. There, George became the first ranking officer cadet in his class before returning to California to study law where, in 1884, he passed the California bar examination and married Ruth Wilson. Ruth was the daughter of the late Benjamin Wilson, one of California's founding fathers, the first elected mayor of Los Angeles, a great landowner and a successful businessman. Together, George and Ruth raised 2 children on Benjamin's glorious Lake Vineyard estate. The first, born on the 11th of November 1885, was given the Patton family's traditional name for a first son, George. Georgie, as George Jr. became known, enjoyed an idyllic childhood with his sister Anne, known as Nita. The pair revelled in the freedom they had to explore the countryside, ride, and do whatever else they could find to entertain and exhaust themselves. They were blissfully unaware that their father had sacrificed his burgeoning legal career to run the by-then ailing Wilson empire, and that he constantly struggled to maintain his family's lifestyle, which included the frequent and lavish entertainment of guests in their large home boasting both servants and stables. One house guest became a permanent fixture, and worked assiduously to dominate the household. Annie, or Nanny as she was known to the family, was Ruth's tyrannical spinster sister. She quickly established herself as a primary influence on young Georgie, whom she mollycoddled as if he were her own. His parents tolerated this, not least because Nanny was a great stimulant to Georgie's imagination by encouraging his role-playing of the fictional characters she read about him from Homer, Scott, Kipling, and Shakespeare, as well as historical figures including Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. His was an informal education until entering school at the age of 11, where some previously identified difficulties with reading, writing, and spelling were confirmed. Biographers disagree over the cause of these learning difficulties, some arguing that they were the result of dyslexia, while others merely the result of his late entry into school. Whatever the cause, the situation demanded that George find ways to overcome the challenges his learning difficulties produced, and he largely succeeded. Although his spelling remained poor for the rest of his life, George S. Patton Jr. became a fluent writer and a voracious reader. Nevertheless, his lack of educational normality and lack of early socialization with other boys in the formal, structured setting of an educational establishment did see George marked out as different during his early years at school, and therefore vulnerable to peers who pounced unsympathetically on anybody unlike themselves. Consequentially, he felt slow, stupid, and something of an outsider while at school, and this in turn created within him a need for approval, reassurance, and acknowledgement. These were also circumstances that fueled George's fiery desire to succeed and, of great importance to him, not disgrace his family name. An intelligent boy who recognized the value of hard work, in time he was able to successfully manage his complicated relationship with words. Indeed, by the age of 16, he began the work required to win a coveted place at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Although West Point then trained a minority of U.S. Army officers, a disproportionate number of its graduates achieved the most senior ranks. Patton prepared for the grueling entrance examination while at VMI, and his father set about mobilizing his agents of influence to win for his son the single West Point nomination that his senator, Thomas R. Bard, could make each year. Application to the task, and not inconsiderable sacrifice on the part of both Georges, led to success. Patton passed the entrance examination in March 1904, and Bard awarded the 18-year-old his nomination soon after. This success reinforced in George that, with discipline, industry, and the right connections, he could achieve anything he wanted. To that end, George wrote to his father that summer determined that he would become a general, stating, "I will do my best to attain what I consider, wrongly perhaps, my destiny." Whatever his destiny, George knew that the 4-year West Point course would be a severe test of his body and mind, as well as a formative experience. The syllabus was heavily academic, with an emphasis on mathematics, the sciences, and engineering. To Patton's chagrin, no specific military history course was offered, and nothing on infantry tactics, all delivered in a dry style by passionless military staff who lacked expertise in what they were teaching. The academy was less a haven of critical thinking and more a crammer-cum-finishing school which exalted discipline and drill. George had no difficulty with bull and starch, but he found the absorbing of vast quantities of knowledge to pass the examinations particularly challenging. Moreover, although he desperately wanted to become a leader, Patton found that West Point offered little developmental opportunity because its officer cadets were admitted on the assumption that they already possessed the necessary traits to be effective leaders. The first, plebe, year was notorious for its hazing, bullying by senior cadets, which was designed to break some cadets and help staff identify those who failed to show the required stoicism. The West Point experience, therefore, produced resilient, courageous, disciplined officers with strong academic credentials, but who knew precious little about soldiering, officership, or leadership. Indeed, George C. Marshall, the future Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, later identified the Academy as having a negative influence on the Army because it taught how to give commands and how to look firm and inexorable, and, what is more, the cadets largely had to find their knowledge of leadership and command from the disciplining of plebes. West Point was very different from the comfortable world Patton had previously inhabited, where his foibles were accepted, his demands acceded to, and his intolerances went unchallenged. The narrow-minded and soft young George, therefore, failed to endear himself to his fellow cadets, whom he derided as of lesser character and not quite gentleman, and he was severely bullied in return. Thus he remained an outsider, devoid of both the close friendships that West Point promoted and the appreciation of his talents that he had come to rely on as a child. Surrounded by capable, bright, fit peers who enjoyed each other's company, Patton wrote frequent self-pitying letters to his father, including one at the end of 1904 which stated, "I am a characterless, lazy, stupid, yet ambitious dreamer, who will degenerate into a third-rate second lieutenant and never command anything more than a platoon." Such missives were most frequently written at times of stress or failure, which meant, therefore, that a flurry of letters arrived in California at the end of his first year when, having failed his mathematics examination, he was required to retake the entire year. Already tenacious and convinced that failing to graduate from West Point was unconscionable, the increasingly obstinate young man redoubled his efforts. In the small black notebook that he took to carrying during his time as an officer cadet in order to record his thoughts, his first entry read simply, "Do your damnedest, always." Over the next 4 years, whenever his academic grades dipped, which they frequently did, he managed to raise them just before his examinations. However, he consistently failed to create any warmth between himself and his fellow officer cadets. When promoted to second corporal in the spring of 1906, for example, Patton's overzealousness and ability to irritate soon saw him demoted to sixth corporal. It was a chastening experience, but he gradually recovered the ranks, the West Point staff showing they valued his military demeanour, to become sergeant major in his third, classman year, and was then promoted into the role he coveted most, regimental adjutant. He was effective in each of these appointments, but never popular because he delighted in punishing the minor infractions of his fellows while boasting that he would be a general by the age of 30. In the back of a library textbook in April 1909, he wrote an unfinished list titled Qualities of a Great General. 1. Tactically aggressive, loves a fight. 2. Strength of character. 3. Steadiness of purpose. 4. Acceptance of responsibility. 5. Energy. 6. Good health and strength. 7. Blank. By the time he had written these words, Patton had already decided that, like the great generals of history, he would wear a mask of command. This mask, he believed, conveyed an authority that he might otherwise lack, and imbued him with a gravitas and an aura that made his leadership compelling. In George's case, however, the mask was less a means of changing persona and more a means of making up for his leadership deficiencies, most notably his poor ability to win the respect of his subordinates. However, in adopting what biographer Carlo d'Este has called his authoritarian, macho warrior personality, Patton remained out of step with other officer cadets, even though he believed they were out of step with him. Patton graduated 46th in a class of 103 in June 1909, revealing a solid but unspectacular performance at the academy despite his grand ambitions. He joined the cavalry, a traditional and glamorous organization well suited to an accomplished rider who had admired the dashing boldness of soldiers on horseback since childhood. The greatest immediate challenge facing Patton on commissioning was how to do what West Point had signally failed to prepare him to do, lead soldiers in the field army. During his 5 years at the academy, he had only very occasionally set eyes on an enlisted man and had not received training in even the most rudimentary military skills, including shooting. As a consequence, when Patton arrived at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, in September 1909 to begin his first tour of duty as a second lieutenant in the 15th Cavalry Regiment, there was some resentment among the men of his platoon that he had the authority and a sense of entitlement, but was useless to them. It was essential, therefore, that Patton absorb as much professional knowledge as he could, as quickly as possible, and develop a strong relationship with his non-commissioned officers, NCOs, in the process. The issue of poorly prepared junior officers was, however, just one of many that beset a U.S. Army whose significant capability deficiencies had been exposed by the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the Filipino-American War, 1899 to 1902. The modernization program that followed was well-intentioned, but with a small budget. With its 85,000 officers and men scattered over a panoply of small, run-down garrisons, the U.S. Army remained a demoralized and fragmented force when Patton joined. Nevertheless, reform had begun before Patton joined the Army, with the ambition of developing it from an old-fashioned frontier police force into something fit for an innovative nation with growing power and expectations. The structural changes that followed, for example, saw the establishment of divisional formations that made the Army capable of undertaking swift expansion should the need arise. Progress was also made in 1903 with the creation of a general staff to plan, investigate and coordinate military activity under the auspices of a Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the professional head of the service. It was an initiative that gave the Army the cerebral and organizational firepower it had been lacking for so long and produced a new emphasis on officer development that was designed to better prepare its people for specific career stages. The enterprise included cohered courses which ran in garrison and branch schools, the Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and at the recently created U.S. Army War College in Washington. The turn of the century also saw a modern officer career management introduced with responsibility for promotions, assignments and tours, and rotation between staff and command assignments punctuated by periodic professional training. In sum, the changes were a significant advance in the professionalization of the U.S. Army and ultimately were of great advantage to ambitious, energetic and talented officers like George Patton. Despite the change gripping the Army at the end of the first decade of the 20th century, there was little to show for it at Fort Sheridan, which remained a small and dilapidated cavalry outpost 30 miles north of Chicago, home to Troop K of the 15th Cavalry Regiment. Patton found a lethargy in the troops' attitude to soldiering which, under the mentorship of Captain Francis Marshall, the patient, professional and diligent commander of the unit, he sought to rectify. Second, Lieutenant Patton inevitably made some elementary mistakes in the early days of his command, mostly the result of the young officer's desire to show the qualities of a strong leader rather than ensuring that his leadership was appropriate. Overplaying his rank, being exceedingly officious and losing his temper, particularly during his first introduction to leading soldiers, were all behaviours that had dogged his time at West Point, and now they haunted his platoon until a combination of NCOs and Marshall taught him the error of his ways. The lessons were hard, but Patton absorbed them. On one occasion, having humiliated an enlisted man in front of his colleagues for failing to properly tether a horse, when his rage subsided, Patton returned and apologized personally to the man in question, and then to all those who had witnessed the unsavory scene. It was the first of many occasions during his long career in which Patton found it necessary to ask for the forgiveness of subordinates, colleagues, or superiors. Marshall pointed out the need for leaders to be aware of their attitudes, behaviors and actions on others, rather than merely expecting a positive reaction to an officer with authority. The wise troop leader also recommended that Patton should seek to have greater empathy with his subordinates, not just to be seen as an officer who took an interest, but to be better placed to energize, motivate, and inspire them day to day. Fort Sheridan was a learning ground for Patton in many ways, be it in the art of leadership, the skills that he expected his men to have, or how to use his spare time for self-improvement. To his credit, while other junior officers frittered away long hours loafing in the mess, Patton read deeply, reflected on the profession of arms, and engaged in a vigorous theoretical correspondence with friends and colleagues. In so doing, he was acting on his own advice, having written in his little black notebook while at West Point, "I believe that in order for a man to become a great soldier, it is necessary for him to be so thoroughly conversant with all sorts of military possibilities that whenever an occasion arises, he has at hand, without effort on his part, a parallel." His assiduous attention to the profession of arms was to become an important part of Patton's life. The young officer also found ample time to participate in a range of sports, particularly those involving horses, but also fencing and pistol shooting, as well as enjoying a full social life in camp and in nearby Chicago. During his frequent trips to the city, he became reacquainted with Beatrice Ayer, the beautiful and talented daughter of an 80-year-old Boston multimillionaire and a distant relative who had visited Lake Vineyard several years earlier. A romance developed, and in May 1910, after a short courtship, the couple were married at Avalon, the Ayer family mansion in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. Yet, while for the young officer the match required relatively minor changes to his lifestyle, for Beatrice, taking a lowly paid junior army officer as her husband and swapping comforts and glamorous society for cramped accommodation in the austere Fort Sheridan, married quarters, it demanded considerable sacrifice. Beatrice had not only married George S. Patton, she had also married the U.S. Army, and she did not find the transition at all easy. The arrival of the couple's first child, Beatrice, known as B, in March 1911, did little to improve Mrs. Patton's feeling of dislocation, for although the baby could have strengthened the union with her husband, it instead sent George into a jealous malaise caused by B's monopolization of her mother, which lasted several months. By the autumn, George had come to recognize that Beatrice was not going to undermine the needs of her child to pamper a selfish husband, and he transformed into the doting father that he was to remain. But the episode did reveal Patton's deep desire to be the center of attention and his proclivity for bouts of poor mental health. Although what precisely caused George's sudden acceptance of his daughter's needs is unknown, being given temporary command of Troop K in Marshall's absence may well have shaken him out of his misery. It was followed soon after by more good news. He had been posted to Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, just 3 miles from the White House. His new job with Troop A at the headquarters of the 15th Cavalry Regiment would put Patton within easy reach of the powerful men in the capital city.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?